A poorly dressed woman in a worn canvas jacket entered Maison Etoile at 7:15 on a Friday evening, and every head in the dining room turned to watch her pass. She wore faded jeans with frayed hems and scuffed canvas shoes that had seen better seasons. The canvas bag slung over her shoulder carried a patched strap held together with safety pins. She moved through the restaurant's entrance with quiet confidence that contradicted her appearance, her observant eyes sweeping across white tablecloths and crystal stemware that caught candlelight like captured stars. The hostess, a young woman named Andrea in an impeccable black dress, hesitated at her podium. Her professional smile flickered for just a moment, uncertainty crossing her features as she calculated how to handle a guest who clearly didn't match the establishment's typical clientele. Maison Etoile occupied a converted warehouse in downtown Seattle, its exposed brick walls softened by warm Edison bulbs and French provincial decor. The dinner crowd tonight included tech executives in tailored suits, anniversary couples dressed for celebration, a table of lawyers still conducting business over wine. And now, this woman in clothes that looked like thrift store rescues. Marcus Rivera watched from the service station near the kitchen entrance, his posture perfectly straight in his crisp black suit and burgundy tie. He had worked at Maison Etoile for 8 years, long enough to read the subtle language of hesitation, the silent judgments that passed between staff when someone unexpected arrived. He saw Andrea glance toward Diana Park, the restaurant manager, seeking guidance. He saw other servers exchange looks, the kind that asked without words, "Who's going to take that table?" Marcus set down the wine bottle he'd been holding and walked toward the entrance with measured steps. His movements carried the practiced grace of someone who understood that service was choreography, every gesture deliberate and meaningful. When he reached the hostess stand, he smiled at the woman with the same warmth he offered every guest who walked through those doors. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying genuine welcome rather than scripted politeness. "Welcome to Maison Etoile. My name is Marcus, and it would be my pleasure to serve you tonight." The woman looked at him directly, and Marcus noticed her eyes, sharp, intelligent, missing nothing. She returned his smile with one that didn't quite reach those observant eyes, as if she were conducting an assessment of her own. "Thank you," she said simply. "A table for one, please." Marcus gestured toward the dining room. "Right this way." Marcus Rivera had not always been a waiter. 10 years ago, he had worn chef's whites at the Seattle Culinary Academy, studying classical French technique under instructors who demanded perfection with every knife cut and sauce reduction. He had dreamed of opening his own restaurant, of earning Michelin recognition, of building something that would make his immigrant father proud. But dreams have a way of shattering against the sharp edges of reality. The phone call came during his final semester. His father, who had worked construction for 30 years to afford Marcus's tuition, had collapsed on a job site. Massive heart attack, gone before the ambulance arrived. Marcus left school the next day. His mother couldn't speak English well enough to navigate the bureaucracy of death. His younger sister, Sophia, was only 12, brilliant and determined to become a doctor, but college seemed impossibly distant without their father's income. Marcus needed money immediately, not eventually. He took the first job that offered cash, bussing tables at a mid-tier restaurant in Capitol Hill. Within 6 months, he'd moved to server position. Within a year, he'd transferred to Maison Etoile, where tips from wealthy regulars could actually pay bills and slowly rebuild savings Sophia would need for university. IT was Henri Beaumont, who taught Marcus that service could be more than survival strategy. Henri had been Maison Etoile's maitre d' for 20 years before his retirement, an elderly Frenchman who moved through the dining room like a conductor leading an orchestra. Marcus remembered the afternoon Henri pulled him aside after watching him serve a table of difficult guests. "You have good technique," Henri had said in his thick accent. "But technique without philosophy is just motion. You want to know the secret of true hospitality?" Marcus had nodded, eager to learn from someone who commanded such respect. Henri had gestured toward the dining room. "Every person who walks through that door arrives carrying invisible burdens. Bad news from the doctor, argument with their spouse, fear about money, loneliness, Our job is not to solve these problems, but to offer them 2 hours where they are seen, where they matter, where someone cares about their comfort without judgment or calculation. He had fixed Marcus with a stern look. We serve the person, not the price tag. The moment you start measuring a guest's worth by their clothing or their ability to tip generously, you have stopped being a professional and become merely a transaction processor. Those words had lodged in Marcus's chest like a splinter that refused to be removed. He adopted Henry's philosophy as personal code, practicing it even when management complained about time spent on tables that wouldn't generate large tips. He studied guests the way he once studied knife techniques, learning to read needs before they became requests, anticipating discomfort before it registered as complaint. Now, 8 years into his tenure at Maison Etoile, Marcus had become the senior waiter younger staff looked to for guidance. Sophia was in her final year at University of Washington, studying pre-med with grades that made acceptance to medical school almost certain. Every scholarship application required proof of financial need and demonstrated family support. Marcus's consistent employment and supplemental contributions made those applications possible. His tips from wealthy regulars, the tech executives who requested him specifically, the anniversary couples who remembered his name from previous visits, funded his sister's textbooks and lab fees. Service had become more than employment. It had become the architecture supporting his family's future. Elena Voss sat in her car for 5 minutes before entering the restaurant, double-checking the recording equipment hidden in her worn canvas bag. The small camera disguised as an outdated smartphone had cost $300 from a private investigator supply company. The digital voice recorder, no larger than a car key fob, could capture conversations from 15 feet away. Both devices were fully charged and tested that afternoon in her downtown office. She was senior food critic for Pacific Northwest Dining Review, a position she had held for 15 years after working her way up from restaurant beat reporter. Her reviews could fill a restaurant for months or empty it within weeks. She had published 732 reviews in her career. 43 of those reviews had resulted in restaurant closures, either directly through her condemnation or indirectly through the spotlight she shone on health violations, discriminatory practices, or financial mismanagement that subsequent investigations confirmed. Elena took no pleasure in closing restaurants. She took satisfaction in protecting diners from establishments that treated hospitality as privilege to be doled out based on appearance, race, or perceived wealth rather than as fundamental right of anyone who walked through the door. 3 weeks ago, her editor David Chun had forwarded her a series of complaints about Maison Etoile. The allegations were specific: hostile service toward elderly diners, preferential treatment for young tech workers, staff making derogatory comments about guests' clothing within earshot. One complaint came from a woman in her 60s who described being seated near the kitchen entrance despite empty tables in the main dining room, then waiting 40 minutes for a server to acknowledge her presence. Another came from a black couple who reported overhearing their server tell another staff member that those people probably couldn't afford the wine list anyway. David had assigned Elena to investigate using her standard methodology: arrive incognito, dress to test whether service quality depended on perceived socioeconomic status. She had conducted this test at 17 restaurants over her career. 14 had failed spectacularly, revealing patterns of discrimination that her subsequent reviews documented with forensic precision. Elena expected Maison Etoile to fail. The complaints fit a familiar pattern she had seen in upscale establishments where management prioritized wealthy clientele over basic human decency. She had researched the restaurant's ownership. James Chun, a second-generation restaurateur whose father had built a small empire of Chinese-American fusion restaurants in the 1980s. Financial records suggested Maison Etoile was struggling, which often correlated with desperate attempts to court high-spending customers while ignoring everyone else. Tonight, Elena would document how staff treated her when she appeared to be someone without money or status. Tomorrow, she would return and design her clothing and observe whether her experience changed. The contrast would form the foundation of her review. If the pattern held, Maison Etoile would join the list of establishments she had exposed for treating hospitality as commodity rather than commitment. She gathered her bag, checked her appearance in the rearview mirror, appropriately shabby, nothing that would suggest professional assessment, and walked toward the restaurant entrance. The real test was about to begin. Marcus guided the woman to table 12, a prime location beside the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Pioneer Square. Evening light filtered through the glass, casting warm amber across the white tablecloth. Other servers had already claimed the high-value tables tonight, the foretop celebrating a business deal, the couple ordering their second bottle of wine before appetizers arrived. Table 12 should have gone to one of them, positioned as it was in the most visible section of the dining room, where wealthy regulars liked to be seen. Andrea, the hostess, had suggested seating the poorly dressed woman in the back section near the service entrance, the tables they reserved for walk-ins and guests without reservations. Marcus had overruled her with a polite but firm gesture toward table 12. If Andrea thought this was poor judgment, she kept that assessment to herself. "Here we are," Marcus said, pulling out the chair with the same flourish he used for every guest. "I'll bring water and give you a moment to look over the menu." The woman settled into her seat, arranging her patched canvas bag carefully at her feet. She accepted the leather-bound menu Marcus presented, her fingers tracing the embossed gold lettering on the cover before opening it. Marcus watched her face as she read the offerings, noting the subtle shift in her expression when she reached the pricing column. The least expensive entree was $32. The most expensive approached $70. That when Marcus returned with water and warm bread, the woman was still studying the menu with the careful attention of someone conducting mental mathematics. Her finger hovered over the daily soup special, butternut squash bisque with sage creme fraiche, $18. Then moved to the house salad at $16. Her gaze drifted to the special board mounted near the bar, where Chef Antoine's feature dish was displayed in elegant script. Coq au vin with herb-roasted fingerlings and pearl onions, $48. Marcus saw something in her face when she looked at that board. Not just hunger, but the particular longing of someone who understood what made a dish exceptional and knew she couldn't afford to experience it. He had seen that expression countless times on his mother's face when they passed bakeries on the way to the discount grocery store. The quick glance at what she couldn't justify purchasing followed by the determined focus forward. "Have you decided?" Marcus asked gently. "The butternut squash soup, please," she said. "And the house salad. $34 before tax and tip." The meal of someone stretching a limited budget as far as it would go. Marcus nodded, writing the order on his pad. Then he set down his pen and made a decision that violated every policy Diana Park had emphasized during their last staff meeting. They were hemorrhaging money, she had said. Every comp meal, every deviation from portion standards, every moment of service spent on guests who wouldn't generate significant revenue was a luxury they could no longer afford. Focus on the tables that tip well. Move the others efficiently, but don't waste time. Henri Beaumont's voice echoed louder than Diana's warnings. "We serve the person, not the price tag." "Our Coq au vin is exceptional tonight," Marcus said. Chef Antoine sourced the chicken from a farm in Snohomish Valley, and the Pinot Noir in the reduction comes from a small vineyard in Willamette. It's the kind of dish that reminds you why French technique matters. The woman's eyes returned to the special board, longing written plainly across her features. "I appreciate that," she said carefully, "but the soup will be perfect." Marcus smiled. "The soup is excellent, but I wonder if you'd allow me to suggest the Coq au vin instead. No additional charge. Consider it a welcome gift from the house." The woman studied him for a long moment, her intelligent eyes searching his face for motive or mockery. Marcus maintained his warm expression, neither defensive nor presumptuous. He was simply offering what Henri had taught him to offer, recognition of someone's humanity expressed through the gesture of feeding them well. "That's very kind," she said finally. "Are you certain?" "Completely certain," Marcus replied. "I'll put the order in right away." He walked toward the kitchen, already calculating how he would handle this with Diana. The POS system would log the comp using his employee code. If questioned, he would offer to pay for the meal himself from his tips. $48 was significant, but not devastating. Sophia's textbook payment wasn't due for 2 weeks. He could absorb this cost. What he couldn't absorb was the weight of looking at someone's longing and choosing policy over compassion. Henri wouldn't have hesitated. Marcus wouldn't either. Diana Park noticed the compte entree on her manager's tablet before Marcus had finished entering the order. The POS system sent automatic alerts for any transaction over $20 that bypassed payment, a safeguard James Chun had implemented 6 months ago when they realized how quickly comp meals could erode already thin profit margins. Diana's tablet buzzed twice, the notification banner displaying Marcus's employee code and the item description. Coco Vin, full price comp, table 12. She found Marcus at the service station near the bar, where he was preparing a breadbasket for another table. Her expression was tight, professionally controlled, but unmistakably frustrated. "Marcus, can I speak with you for a moment?" Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trying to have a difficult conversation in a public space. They stepped into the narrow hallway between the dining room and the kitchen, where the sound of Chef Antoine's voice could be heard shouting instructions about sauce temperatures. Diana held up her tablet, the comp transaction displayed prominently on the screen. "Talk to me about table 12, she said. Marcus had expected this confrontation. He kept his voice calm and respectful. A guest who would appreciate the Coco Vin, but couldn't afford it. "I made a judgment call to comp the upgrade from soup and salad." Diana closed her eyes briefly, a gesture Marcus recognized as her trying to maintain patience. When she opened them, her expression had softened slightly, but her words remained firm. "Marcus, you know I respect your service philosophy. You're one of the best servers we have. But we're 2 months from closing this restaurant permanently. 2 months. Every dish costs us money. Ingredients, preparation time, overhead. We can't afford generosity right now, no matter how well-intentioned. With respect," Marcus said, "we can't afford to lose our integrity either. If we start treating guests differently based on their clothing—" "This isn't about clothing," Diana interrupted. "It's about survival. James is meeting with the bank next week to discuss an extension on our loan. They want to see improved revenue numbers, or they're calling the note. If we fail, 43 people lose their jobs. That matters more than one comped meal." Marcus absorbed this information like a physical blow. He had known the restaurant was struggling. The reduced staffing, the cheaper ingredients appearing on some dishes, the tension in management meetings. But he hadn't realized they were this close to closure. Diana continued, her voice dropping lower. "There's something else you need to know. We're being reviewed by Pacific Northwest Dining Review. We received notice this morning. A critic has been assigned to evaluate us, and we have no idea when they'll show up or what they'll look like. Every interaction matters right now. Every guest could be the person who decides whether we survive." She gestured toward the dining room. "That poorly dressed woman at table 12? She could be the critic, Marcus, testing whether we provide excellent service to everyone or just the people who look like they belong in a high-end restaurant. And you just comped her meal, which could look like you're performing for an audience rather than providing genuine hospitality." Marcus felt the irony of her concern settle in his chest. He had comped the meal because of his genuine values, not his performance. But explaining that distinction suddenly felt impossible. Diana was operating from fear, from the desperate mathematics of a failing business where every decision carried catastrophic potential. "I understand your concerns," Marcus said carefully. "But if that woman is the critic, then she saw me treat her the same way I treat every guest. That's the story we want to tell, isn't it? That Maison Etoile provides excellence regardless of who walks through the door." Diana's expression showed she wanted to agree, but couldn't afford to. "Just be careful, Marcus. I can't override James's decisions about comps. If he sees this, there will be consequences." She walked away before Marcus could respond, her tablet already lighting up with new notifications about table turnover rates and reservation gaps. Marcus stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the controlled chaos of the kitchen beyond the door. Chef Antoine was plating something, his voice calling for more precision, more care. This is art, not assembly line work. Rebecca Torres, the sous chef, emerged from the kitchen carrying the Coco Vin. She was 29, talented enough to run her own kitchen, but staying at Maison Etoile because Antoine was teaching her classical technique she couldn't learn anywhere else in Seattle. She caught sight of Marcus and smiled. "Heard you comped table 12, she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Diana's upset, but I think you did the right thing. This dish deserves to be appreciated by someone who'll actually taste it, not just Instagram it." She had plated the coco vin with extraordinary care. The chicken was positioned artfully on the ceramic plate, sauce glistening under the kitchen lights, fingerling potatoes arranged like small sculptures, pearl onions scattered with precision. A tiny edible flower garnished the center, purple petals that added color without overwhelming the rustic elegance of the dish. "You made it beautiful," Marcus said. Rebecca shrugged, but her smile widened. That woman looked at the special board like she was reading poetry. "Someone who appreciates food that much deserves our best work." She handed him the plate, and Marcus carried it toward table 12, navigating between other diners with practiced ease. He had made his choice. Now he would serve the dish with the same care Rebecca had used in its creation, and trust that Henry's philosophy, serve the person, not the price tag, would prove its worth. Marcus set the coco vin before the woman at table 12 with the same deliberate grace he brought to every service. The plate settled onto the white tablecloth without sound, positioned precisely so the visual composition faced her directly. Steam rose from the dish in delicate wisps, carrying the rich aroma of wine reduction, herbs, and chicken that had been braised to perfect tenderness. "Coq au vin," Marcus said, his voice carrying genuine enthusiasm rather than scripted presentation. Chef Antoine sourced the chicken from Willow Creek Farm in Snohomish. They raise heritage breeds on pasture, which gives the meat exceptional flavor and texture. The wine in the reduction is a Pinot Noir from Willamette Valley, aged 18 months in French oak. The sauce includes pearl onions caramelized with brown sugar and thyme, cremini mushrooms sautéed in butter, and these fingerling potatoes finished with roasted garlic and rosemary. He gestured to each component as he described it, not lecturing, but sharing information with someone he instinctively recognized as capable of appreciating the details. The preparation takes 3 hours from start to finish. Chef Antoine insists on braising the chicken slowly so the meat practically falls away from the bone, and the sauce reduces until it coats the back of a spoon. The woman looked up at him, and Marcus saw something unexpected in her expression. Not gratitude, though that was present, but also recognition, as if she understood that he was describing this dish not to impress her, but because he genuinely believed she would value knowing its story. "Thank you," she said, and her voice carried layers of meaning Marcus couldn't fully interpret. "This is extraordinarily generous." "The generosity is in Chef Antoine's technique," Marcus replied with a smile. "I'm simply fortunate to serve it. Please, take your time and enjoy. I'll check back shortly." He stepped away, giving her privacy for the first bite, the moment when anticipation transforms into experience. From his position at the service station, Marcus watched her pick up her fork and knife. She cut into the chicken with the careful precision of someone who understood proper technique, the knife sliding through meat that offered almost no resistance. The first bite reached her mouth, and Marcus saw her pause, her eyes closed. Not dramatically, not as performance, but with the unconscious response of someone encountering something unexpectedly excellent. When she opened her eyes again, she looked at the plate with renewed attention, as if seeing it properly for the first time. She took another bite, this time including sauce and potato. Then another, slower, clearly analyzing the layered flavors. Marcus returned to refill her water glass, arriving at the precise moment when she might need it without hovering intrusively. She looked up, and he was struck again by the intelligence in her eyes, the way she seemed to be cataloging every detail of the interaction. "How is everything?" he asked. "Exceptional," she said, and the word carried weight beyond politeness. "The sauce has remarkable depth. I can taste the wine, obviously, but there's something else, maybe cognac. And the herbs are fresh, not dried. The chicken is perfectly cooked, which is rarer than it should be." Marcus felt surprised pleasure at her observation. Most guests complimented food in general terms, delicious or wonderful. But this woman was tasting with educated palate, identifying specific elements that revealed technical mastery. Chef Antoine does add a splash of cognac to the sauce near the end, Marcus confirmed. Most people don't catch that. And yes, we use fresh herbs exclusively. He believes dried herbs are acceptable for home cooking, but unforgivable in professional kitchens. They shared a smile, a moment of connection between two people who understood that food could be more than fuel, that preparation and service could elevate a meal into something approaching art. Throughout the rest of her dinner, Marcus maintained attentive presence without intrusion. He refilled her water before she had to ask. He noticed when she needed another napkin after sauce dripped slightly, appearing with a fresh one folded into an elegant triangle. He timed his check-ins to coincide with natural pauses in her meal. Never interrupting while she was clearly focused on tasting, he watched her observe the dining room between bites, her gaze moving systematically across tables. She seemed to be studying something, though Marcus couldn't determine what. He saw her attention linger on a table where another server was managing a difficult guest, someone complaining loudly about wine temperature. The server handled it professionally, but with visible tension. The woman at table 12 watched this interaction with particular interest, and Marcus noticed her making subtle movements with her hand beneath the table, as if taking notes on something hidden in her lap. When she finished the cocoa vin, having consumed every element on the plate with obvious appreciation, Marcus approached to clear. "Can I interest you in dessert this evening? Chef Antoine's creme brulee is exceptional, or we have a chocolate marquise with raspberry coulis." The woman hesitated, and Marcus recognized the calculation happening behind her eyes, the dessert menu pricing weighing against whatever budget she was managing. Before she could decline, he added, "The creme brulee is particularly good tonight. I'd be happy to bring you one on the house. You've been a pleasure to serve." She studied him for a long moment, that analytical gaze seeming to look past his professional exterior towards something deeper. "You're very kind," she said finally, "but the meal was more than enough. It was perfect, actually. Thank you for your generosity and your exceptional service." Marcus nodded, accepting her decision without pressure. "Then let me bring you the check." "Actually," she said, "there's no need. You said the meal was complimentary." "The entree was my gift," Marcus clarified. "But your water, bread, and any wine or additional items would normally—" "I only had water," she interrupted gently. "And if you comp the entree, I assume that included the experience, yes?" Marcus smiled, understanding her point. "Of course. Consider everything taken care of. It was genuinely my pleasure to serve you this evening." He meant it, despite the tension with Diana, despite the financial risk, despite everything. Serving this woman had reminded him why he chose this profession. She had appreciated the food with educated palate, treated him with respect rather than the invisible indifference many guests showed service staff, and received his generosity with grace that acknowledged the gesture without diminishing it. As she gathered her patched canvas bag and prepared to leave, she paused beside the table and looked at Marcus directly. "What's your name?" she asked. "Marcus Rivera." "Well, Marcus Rivera," she said, and something in her tone suggested she was committing this information to memory with particular care. "You've reminded me that excellent service isn't about performance or policy. It's about seeing people and choosing to honor them. That's increasingly rare." "Thank you." She extended her hand, and Marcus shook it, noting the firm confidence of her grip, the way her eyes held his with directness that suggested equality rather than the subtle hierarchy many wealthy guests maintained even in moments of appreciation. Then she walked toward the exit, moving through the elegant dining room with that same quiet confidence she'd carried on arrival. Marcus watched her go, unaware that he had just passed a test he didn't know he was taking, unaware that the woman in worn clothing held power to close his restaurant or save it, unaware that his choice to serve with integrity regardless of policy or profit would determine not just his future, but the futures of 43 people whose livelihoods depended on Maison Etoile's survival. The dining room continued its Friday evening rhythm. Other guests finished meals, paid checks, left tips. Marcus returned to his station and began resetting table 12 for the next seating. As he arranged fresh silverware and folded a new napkin, Rebecca emerged from the kitchen. "Did she like it?" the sous chef asked. "She understood it," Marcus replied, and somehow that felt like the highest compliment he could offer. Elena Voss did not leave Maison Etoile after finishing her meal. Instead, she ordered coffee and remained at table 12 for another 70 minutes, watching Marcus Rivera work with a focused attention she typically reserved for evaluating food presentation. What she observed during that time would form the foundation of a review that had nothing to do with Chef Antoine's technical mastery and everything to do with the person serving it. She watched Marcus assist a young busser struggling with a heavily loaded tray, stepping smoothly into the young man's path and taking half the weight without drawing attention to the intervention. The busser, who couldn't have been older than 20, shot Marcus a grateful look. Marcus simply nodded and continued toward the kitchen as if helping colleagues was automatic reflex rather than noteworthy action. She observed him serve a table with 2 young children, one of whom knocked over a water glass within minutes of sitting down. Other diners nearby looked annoyed by the disruption. Marcus appeared with fresh linens and a replacement glass within seconds, kneeling beside the child's chair to make eye contact at the boy's level. Elena couldn't hear what he said, but whatever it was made the child laugh instead of cry. The parents visibly relaxed, and the rest of their meal proceeded without incident. She noticed how Marcus moved through the dining room with spatial awareness that suggested years of practice. He never collided with other servers, never made guests feel crowded when he reached past them to set down plates, never interrupted conversations at awkward moments. His timing was impeccable, arriving to refill wine glasses just as they approached empty, clearing plates within seconds of guests setting down their forks, appearing to answer questions before they were fully formed. But what struck Elena most forcefully was the consistency. A table of tech executives in expensive suits received the same attentive service as an elderly couple celebrating an anniversary on what was clearly a modest budget. A woman dining alone with a book got the same respectful distance and timely check-ins as a group of loud tourists who kept changing their orders. Marcus treated every guest as if they were the most important person in the dining room, and he did it without visible effort or calculation. Elena had reviewed restaurants in 17 states over 15 years. She had encountered thousands of servers, from rank beginners fumbling through their first shifts to seasoned professionals who could manage 12 tables simultaneously without breaking composure. Marcus Rivera was something rarer. He was someone who had transformed service from employment into calling, who understood that hospitality was fundamentally about recognition, seeing people and choosing to honor their presence through care and attention. 30 minutes into her observation, Diana Park approached Marcus near the bar. Elena couldn't hear their conversation, but she read the body language clearly. Diana was upset about something, her gestures sharp and frustrated. Marcus listened with patient stillness, his expression suggesting he understood her concerns but wouldn't be swayed by them. When Diana walked away, her shoulders tight with unresolved tension, Marcus took a moment to compose himself before returning to the dining room floor. His professional mask never slipped in front of guests. Elena made notes in the small leather journal she'd pulled from her canvas bag, her handwriting quick and precise. She documented specific observations, timing of service, consistency across different guest demographics, staff dynamics, Marcus's training of younger employees. She photographed the dining room discreetly, capturing wide shots that showed table arrangements and atmosphere rather than identifying individual diners. What she didn't write, what she was still processing, was the realization that she had arrived expecting to document discriminatory service and instead had witnessed something worth celebrating. The complaints that brought her to Maison Etoile, the allegations of hostile treatment toward certain guests, seemed increasingly disconnected from the reality she was observing. Either those complaints were fabricated or they reflected problems that had been corrected. What existed now was a service culture that Marcus Rivera clearly helped shape, where dignity was offered universally rather than rationed based on perceived worth. Elena watched Marcus serve his final table of the evening, a young couple on what appeared to be an early date. The woman was nervous, fiddling with her napkin. The man kept checking his phone. Marcus approached their table with wine recommendations that matched their stated preferences and budget rather than pushing expensive bottles. He gave them space when conversation flowed and provided general structure when awkward silences stretched too long. By the time dessert arrived, both diners were relaxed, laughing, leaning toward each other across the table. Service as facilitation of human connection. That's what Elena was witnessing. Marcus wasn't simply delivering food and beverages. He was creating conditions where people could relax enough to be themselves, where celebration felt enhanced and loneliness felt less acute and difficult conversations became slightly easier. When Elena finally stood to leave, approaching the hostess stand to return her table number, she saw Marcus across the dining room, resetting a table for the next day's service. His movements were methodical and careful, straightening chairs, folding napkins into elegant triangles, adjusting silverware to precise angles. He worked as if someone were watching, maintaining standards even in moments when no guests were present to appreciate the effort. That, Elena thought, was the difference between performance and integrity. Performance happened when observation created incentive. Integrity happened regardless of audience. She walked out into the Seattle evening, the weight of what she'd witnessed settling into her chest like something precious and fragile. She had power to write a review that could save or destroy this restaurant. And for the first time in months, she felt the full gravity of that responsibility. Elena sat in her Subaru in the parking garage 3 blocks from Maison Etoile, her laptop balanced on the steering wheel, fingers hovering above the keyboard. The dashboard clock read 9:47. She had approximately 12 hours before her editor David Shun would expect a preliminary draft of her review. 12 hours to transform observations into words that would determine whether 43 people kept their jobs. She began with the food, because food was objective territory where her expertise remained unchallenged. Chef Antoine Moreau's technique was classically sound, his sourcing thoughtful, his execution consistent with what she'd expect from a restaurant charging these prices. The coq au vin demonstrated mastery of French fundamentals. Proper braising technique, well-balanced sauce, quality ingredients treated with respect rather than over-manipulation. If this were purely a food review, she would award Maison Etoile 4 out of 5 stars and recommend it without reservation. But the complaints that brought her here weren't about food quality. They alleged discriminatory service, hostile treatment of guests who didn't fit the restaurant's desired demographic profile. Elena had arrived dressed to test that allegation, wearing clothing that marked her as economically marginal, someone who clearly couldn't afford the menu prices without sacrifice. She typed, Maison Etoile's fate rests not in its kitchen, which operates with competent professionalism, but in the hands of its front-of-house staff. Service quality determines whether technical excellence reaches guests with hospitality or mere transaction. Elena paused, considering how to articulate what she'd witnessed. Marcus Rivera had treated her with identical care and attention he provided to wealthy regulars. He had comped an expensive entree for a stranger in worn clothing, risking policy violation and potential professional consequences. He had served her as if she deserved excellence not because she could pay for it, but because she was human and present. That gesture could be interpreted 2 ways. Either Marcus was performing for a suspected critic, manufacturing generosity for evaluation purposes, or he was demonstrating values he practiced consistently, and Elena's presence simply made visible what he did routinely. She had stayed 90 minutes to answer that question, watching how Marcus served other guests when he had no reason to believe anyone was evaluating him. The consistency she observed suggested the latter interpretation. This wasn't performance. This was character. Elena opened a second document, a draft timeline of her observations with timestamps. 7:15 p.m. Arrival. Dressed in worn clothing, 7:18 p.m. Hostess hesitates. Marcus intervenes. Seats me at premium, table 7:25 p.m. Menu presented with identical courtesy shown to other guests 7:40 p.m. Marcus comps coke au vin upgrade without being asked 8:15 p.m. Marcus assists struggling busser 8:30 p.m. Marcus handles spilled water incident with child 8:45 p.m. Marcus receives criticism from manager. Diana Park 9:00 p.m. Marcus serves all guests with identical attentiveness regardless of appearance or spending level. She closed the timeline and returned to the review draft. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with gathering conviction. Service industry workers occupy a paradoxical position in American culture. We depend on them for comfort and sustenance, yet we often treat them as invisible machinery rather than skilled professionals. We demand excellence but resist paying fairly for it. We expect hospitality but withhold basic respect. Marcus Rivera at Maison Etoile represents what service can be when practitioners approach it as calling rather than employment. In 10 years of reviewing restaurants across the Pacific Northwest, I have encountered perhaps a dozen servers who demonstrate his combination of technical skill and genuine care for guest welfare. His service doesn't vary based on perceived ability to tip generously or social status. He treats everyone as worthy of attention and dignity. Elena stopped typing and rubbed her eyes. She was exhausted, but not from the long evening. She was exhausted from carrying the weight of judgment, from knowing that her words could close restaurants and end careers. Tonight she had the opportunity to celebrate something excellent, to document a service culture worth preserving. But she needed to understand the full context. The complaints that brought her here suggested systemic problems, not isolated incidents. If Marcus was exceptional individual operating within problematic organizational culture, her review needed to reflect that distinction. If he represented the values the restaurant genuinely practiced, then the complaints were either outdated or fabricated. She would return tomorrow night, this time dressed professionally, and conduct a second evaluation. If the service quality remained consistent, if other staff demonstrated similar values, then she would write a review that could save Maison Etoile. If the quality collapsed when she appeared wealthy, if preferential treatment emerged, then she would document that contrast with forensic precision. Elena saved her draft and closed the laptop. Through the windshield, she could see the Seattle skyline against the dark sky. Thousands of windows glowing with lives being lived in parallel. Somewhere in one of those buildings, Marcus Rivera was probably heading home, unaware that a woman in worn clothing held his professional future in her hands. Somewhere, James Chun was reviewing financial spreadsheets, calculating how many weeks remained before closure became inevitable. Tomorrow night would determine which future materialized. Elena started her car and drove toward her apartment in Capitol Hill, carrying the weight of power she had never asked for but accepted as responsibility inherent to her profession. James Chun called the emergency staff meeting for 10 o'clock Saturday morning, 5 hours before lunch service would begin. Attendance was mandatory for all front-of-house staff and kitchen leadership. Marcus arrived at Maison Etoile to find Diana already present, her expression carrying the strained tension of someone who had slept poorly and expected the day to worsen. The restaurant felt different without guests, the dining room stripped of the warm atmosphere that candlelight and conversation provided. In harsh morning light, Marcus could see details usually hidden: the scuff marks on the baseboards, the slight water stains on the ceiling tiles, the wear patterns in the carpet near high-traffic areas. These were signs of a business struggling to maintain appearances while cash reserves dwindled toward crisis. James stood at the front of the assembled group, 10 staff members total. For servers including Marcus, 2 bussers, the hostess Andrea, Chef Antoine, sous chef Rebecca, and Diana. James looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past month. His hair had gone noticeably grayer at the temples, and his expensive suit hung slightly loose, suggesting weight loss from stress. "I'll get directly to the point," James said, dispensing with pleasantries. "Pacific Northwest Dining Review contacted us yesterday afternoon. A critic visited last night and will return tonight for final evaluation before publishing their review. This review will determine whether we survive the next quarter or close permanently." The room absorbed this information in silence. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Diana had mentioned the possibility of a critic, but he hadn't realized the review was already underway. James continued, his voice carrying barely controlled desperation. "I need everyone to understand our situation. We are 8 weeks from insolvency. The bank has given us until the end of next month to demonstrate improved revenue, or they will call our loan. If that happens, we close. 43 people, including everyone in this room and the evening staff not present, will lose their jobs. He pulled up something on his tablet and turned it to face the group. Marcus could see a spreadsheet with columns of red numbers. Our revenue is down 37% compared to this time last year. Food costs have increased, staffing costs have increased, rent has increased, but our customer base has shrunk. We've received complaints about inconsistent service quality. Some of these complaints are legitimate. Some appear to be from a disgruntled former employee fabricating problems. Regardless of their source, they've damaged our reputation. James's eyes moved across the assembled staff, settling on Marcus with particular intensity. Diana informed me that last night, Marcus comped a $48 entree for a guest at table 12. A poorly dressed woman who ordered inexpensive items. Marcus upgraded her to our most expensive special without authorization and without payment. Marcus kept his expression neutral, refusing to show the dread pooling in his chest. Diana also informed me, James continued, that this guest was likely the food critic. She matched the profile, arrives alone, dressed in a way that tests whether we provide equal service regardless of appearance, observes everything carefully. James set down his tablet and looked directly at Marcus. You potentially cost us this review, Marcus. If the critic thinks you were performing for her benefit rather than providing genuine service, she'll document that in her review as manipulation. If she doesn't realize she was the recipient of special treatment, she might praise us, but that praise will be based on false premises. With respect, Marcus said carefully, I didn't know that woman was a critic. I treated her the same way I treat every guest. That's precisely the problem. James snapped, his composure cracking. We can't afford to comp expensive meals for every guest who walks in looking like they can't pay for it. We have to focus resources on guests who generate significant revenue. That's not discrimination, Marcus. It's survival. Chef Antoine, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Marcus was right to comp that meal. The woman appreciated the food. Rebecca told me she understood the technique, tasted every component properly. The kind of guest deserves to experience our work. What guests deserve, James said, his voice tight, is irrelevant compared to what we can afford. And right now, we can't afford generosity. He turned back to Marcus. I'm suspending you for tonight's service. The critic will return for her final evaluation, and I can't risk you providing obviously special treatment that makes our entire operation look like performance rather than standard practice. The words landed like physical blows. Marcus felt the room tilt slightly, his vision narrowing. Suspended. He would lose tonight's tips, easily $300 on a Saturday. Sophia's tuition payment was due in 2 weeks. Her textbook cost for next semester came to $470. He had been calculating carefully, budgeting every shift, and now he was losing critical income. James, Diana said, her voice carrying a note of protest. Marcus is our best server. Having him absent tonight might hurt more than help. My decision is final, James said. Marcus, clean out your locker. You're suspended for tonight's service. We'll reassess after the review is published. Marcus stood slowly, aware that everyone was watching him. He could argue, could point out the injustice of being punished for demonstrating the values the restaurant claimed to hold. But arguing would accomplish nothing except creating a scene that would make everyone uncomfortable. Understood, he said quietly as he walked toward the staff area in the back, past the kitchen where the prep cooks were beginning to prep vegetables for evening service, past the walk-in cooler humming with mechanical consistency, past the dry storage room where bulk supplies sat on metal shelving. His locker was in a narrow hallway lined with staff belongings. Coats hung on hooks, shoes tucked beneath benches, the accumulated clutter of people who spent more waking hours at work than home. Marcus opened his locker. Inside was a spare tie in case he stained the one he was wearing, a small photo of Sophia in her white coat from clinical rotations, taped to the inside of the door, and a worn copy of Auguste Escoffier's Luc Guide Culinaire that Henri Beaumont had given him years ago with an inscription, For Marcus, remember that service is an art form. Practice it with integrity. He took the photo and the book, leaving the tie. Rebecca appeared beside him, her face showing the kind of anger that came from watching injustice happen to someone you respected. "This is wrong," she said quietly. "You did nothing wrong." "James is scared," Marcus replied, trying to keep bitterness from his voice. "Scared people make panicked decisions. That doesn't excuse punishing you for having principles." Marcus closed the locker gently. "It's one night, Rebecca. I'll survive one night." But even as he said it, he wasn't certain it was true. One night meant lost income he couldn't easily replace. One night meant Sophia would text asking about textbook money, and he wouldn't know how to answer. One night meant watching the life he'd carefully constructed through 8 years of discipline and sacrifice begin to crumble. Because he'd chosen compassion over policy, he walked toward the back exit, the one that opened onto an alley where delivery trucks unloaded supplies and staff took smoke breaks. The morning air was cold, carrying the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Marcus stood beside the dumpsters, holding the book Henri had given him and the photo of his sister, feeling the weight of how quickly security could dissolve. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from Sophia. "Hey, can you help with textbook costs for next semester? Around $470. I can pay you back after I get my work-study paycheck, but I need them before classes start. Love you." Marcus stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He didn't know how to answer. He didn't know how to explain that he'd just been suspended for being kind, that the values he'd taught her, treat everyone with dignity, never let money determine someone's worth, had collided with economic reality so forcefully that he might not be able to afford keeping her in school. He closed the message without responding and leaned against the brick wall, closing his eyes against the morning light. Somewhere above him, in her apartment or car, Elena Voss was finalizing her observations and preparing to return for a second evaluation. Somewhere, James Chun was reviewing spreadsheets and calculating survival odds. And Marcus was standing in an alley holding everything that mattered, wondering if integrity was a luxury he could no longer afford. Elena Voss arrived at Maison Etoile at 6:30 Saturday evening, and this time she looked like exactly what she was, a woman of professional authority and financial means. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer over a silk blouse, dark jeans that cost more than many people's weekly groceries, and leather ankle boots from a designer boutique in Pike Place Market. Her hair, which had been pulled back simply the night before, was styled with deliberate elegance. She carried a structured handbag instead of the patched canvas bag. The transformation was intentional and absolute. If Maison Etoile's service quality changed based on perceived wealth, Elena would document that shift with precision that would form the centerpiece of her review. Andrea, the hostess, greeted her with immediate recognition and barely concealed nervousness. "Good evening, Ms. Voss. We've been expecting you. Mr. Chin asked me to escort you to his office when you arrived." Elena had not made a reservation under her real name, which meant the restaurant had identified her from last night's visit. That was unsurprising. Most establishments figured out when critics were present, either through staff recognition or later analysis of unusual guest behavior. What mattered was how they responded to that knowledge. "Please lead the way," Elena said. She followed Andrea through the dining room, which was beginning to fill with early Saturday guests. Elena scanned the floor looking for Marcus Rivera and didn't see him. She noted a different server working the section that included table 12, a younger man who moved with competent efficiency but lacked Marcus's fluid grace. James Chin's office was located on the second floor, accessible via a narrow staircase near the kitchen. The space was small and cluttered, dominated by a desk covered in financial documents and a laptop displaying what appeared to be reservation management software. James stood when Elena entered, extending his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Voss, thank you for giving us the opportunity to host you. I'm James Chun, owner of Maison Etoile. I hope your experience last night was exceptional." Elena shook his hand briefly. "It was informative. I'm here tonight for a follow-up evaluation before finalizing my review." "Of course," James said, gesturing to a chair. "Before you dine, I wanted to personally welcome you and offer complimentary wine pairings for your meal. We have an excellent sommelier on staff who can— That won't be necessary, Elena interrupted. I prefer to evaluate restaurants under standard conditions rather than special accommodation. James's smile faltered slightly. I understand. Well, please know that our entire staff is committed to providing you with service that reflects our establishment's values. Elena decided to dispense with pleasantries. She had limited patience for owners who performed hospitality for critics while neglecting ordinary guests. Mr. Chun, before I dine tonight, I need to ask you a direct question. Where is Marcus Rivera? James's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features before he regained control. Marcus isn't working tonight. We adjusted our staffing for this evening's service. What? Elena asked, her tone leaving no room for evasion. James hesitated, clearly calculating how much to reveal. Diana Park, who had been standing quietly near the door, spoke up. Marcus was suspended for tonight's service due to a policy violation, she said, her voice carrying reluctance. He comped an expensive meal last night without proper authorization. Elena felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. The meal he comped for me. The silence that followed confirmed her statement. James's face revealed that he understood the tactical error too late. Admitting they'd suspended Marcus exposed exactly the kind of management decision Elena found indefensible. Can you explain your reasoning? Elena asked, pulling a notebook from her handbag with deliberate slowness. Why would you suspend your best server for providing excellent service to a guest who appeared unable to afford your menu prices? James tried to recover. It wasn't about the quality of service. It was about financial constraints. We're operating under extremely tight margins, and unauthorized comps create— Let me rephrase, Elena said, her voice cutting through his explanation with surgical precision. You suspended Marcus Rivera because he treated me with dignity when I looked poor. You removed him from tonight's service because you're afraid I'll realize that his generosity was genuine rather than performance orchestrated for my benefit. She watched James struggle to formulate a response that wouldn't confirm her assessment, while also not lying outright to a critic whose review could destroy him. Our situation is complicated, James finally said. We're 8 weeks from closure. The bank is calling our loan if we don't demonstrate improved revenue. Every decision I make right now has to prioritize survival, including punishing integrity. Elena asked. Diana stepped forward, her expression suggesting she'd made a difficult decision. Ms. Voss, James is telling you the truth about our financial situation. But he's wrong about Marcus. Marcus Rivera has worked here for 8 years. He treats every guest with identical care regardless of appearance or spending capacity. What he did for you last night wasn't special treatment. It was demonstration of values he practices consistently. James shot Diana a look that clearly communicated she was overstepping her authority, but Diana continued anyway. I've managed this restaurant for 6 years. I've watched Marcus train newer servers, diffuse difficult situations, create an atmosphere where guests feel valued. The complaints that brought you here about discriminatory service, those came from a former manager we fired for theft. He filed them as revenge. They don't reflect the culture Marcus helped build. Elena absorbed this information, her analytical mind sorting facts for manipulation. She believed Diana. The manager's words carried the ring of someone risking professional consequences to defend colleague. James, Elena said, turning back to the owner, I came tonight prepared to write one of 2 reviews. The first would praise your food while condemning management that punishes staff for demonstrating hospitality. The second would celebrate a restaurant where stated values match actual practice. You have approximately 10 minutes to help me decide which review I write. She could see James processing the ultimatum, understanding that his next actions would determine not just the review's content, but whether Maison Etoile survive the next quarter. What do you want me to do? James asked, his voice stripped of its earlier performance, now carrying only exhausted honesty. Call Marcus, Elena said. Apologize. Ask him to return for tonight's service. Pay him double for the shifts you cost him. and understand that the server who demonstrated genuine hospitality to a guest in worn clothing is worth more to your establishment than any profit margin calculation. She stood, closing her notebook. I'll be in the dining room. If Marcus arrives within the next 30 minutes, I'll remain for a full meal and evaluation. If he doesn't, I'll leave and publish a review that documents exactly why restaurants like yours struggle. Not because of food quality or economic pressure, but because management forgets that hospitality is fundamentally about recognizing human dignity. Elena walked out of the office without waiting for James's response. She descended the stairs and returned to the dining room, where she took a seat at the bar rather than requesting a table. She ordered a glass of Sancerre and waited, checking her watch with deliberate visibility. Behind her, in the office on the second floor, James Chan was making the most important phone call of his professional life. Marcus was sitting in his apartment when his phone rang, staring at Sophia's unanswered text message about textbook costs. The apartment was a modest one-bedroom in the Greenwood neighborhood, affordable only because he'd been renting it for 6 years before the area gentrified around him. The walls needed repainting, and the kitchen appliances dated from the 1990s, but it was home. The photo of Sophia, in her white coat, sat on a small table beside a framed picture of his father wearing a construction hard hat, smiling at the camera with the kind of uncomplicated pride working men carry when they know their labor builds things that last. The caller ID showed James Chun. Marcus almost didn't answer. What could James possibly say that would change anything? But habit and residual professionalism made him accept the call. Marcus, James's voice came through, stripped of the authority it usually carried. I need to ask you to come back to the restaurant. Right now. I made a mistake suspending you, and I need to fix it. Marcus sat forward, confusion replacing resignation. What happened? The critic is here. She identified herself, and she told me that if you don't return for tonight's service, she's leaving and writing a review that will close us. Marcus felt a strange detachment, as if he were observing this conversation from outside his own body. The woman from table 12. Yes, Elena Voss, senior critic for Pacific Northwest Dining Review. She knows I suspended you for comping her meal. She knows why you did it, and she's given me 30 minutes to get you back here or she walks. Marcus thought about the principle at stake, about what returning would mean. He could refuse, let James suffer consequences for poor judgment, let the restaurant fail because management valued profit over integrity. It would be justified. It would prove a point. But 43 people depended on Maison Etoile for their livelihoods. Rebecca Torres, who was saving money to open her own place. Diana Park, who had a daughter in middle school. The young busser Marcus had helped last night, who was putting himself through community college. They didn't deserve to lose their jobs because James had panicked. I'll come, Marcus said, but not because you're ordering me. Because the staff deserves better than this situation. Whatever your reason, thank you, James said, and Marcus heard something in his voice that might have been shame. Marcus, I'm sorry. I was wrong. 15 minutes later, Marcus walked through Maison Etoile's back entrance, still wearing jeans and a pullover sweater, carrying his work clothes in a canvas bag. He changed quickly in the staff area, emerging in his black suit and burgundy tie, adjusting his collar in the small mirror beside the time clock. Diana was waiting for him. She's at the bar, drinking Sancerre and looking at her watch every 3 minutes. You made it with 7 minutes to spare. Marcus nodded and walked toward the dining room. His heart was beating faster than usual, adrenaline mixing with curiosity about meeting the woman whose judgment carried power to save or destroy. Elena Voss turned when she heard his footsteps, and their eyes met across the dining room. Marcus saw recognition in her face, but also something deeper, respect, perhaps, or solidarity. He approached the bar with the same composed professionalism he brought to every interaction. Ms. Voss, he said, I'm told you've been waiting for me. I apologize for the delay. Elena stood, extending her hand. When Marcus shook it, her grip was firm and direct. Please call me Elena. And you have nothing to apologize for, Marcus. I'm the one who should apologize for creating a situation where your integrity cost you employment, even temporarily. She gestured to the bar stool beside her. Would you sit with me for a moment before service begins? I have something I need to explain. Marcus sat, aware that other staff were watching from various positions around the dining room. James was visible through the office window on the second floor, his face tight with anxiety. Elena pulled out her laptop and opened a document. Last night, I arrived at your restaurant dressed to test whether your service quality varied based on perceived wealth. I've conducted that test at 17 establishments over my career. 14 failed catastrophically, ignored me, seated me poorly, provided minimal service until I returned dressed professionally, then fawned over me. The contrast formed the basis for reviews that resulted in closures. She turned the laptop so Marcus could see the screen. You didn't fail that test. You treated me with identical care and generosity you provided to every other guest. I stayed for 90 minutes after my meal observing how you worked. I watched you help struggling colleagues, manage difficult situations, serve diverse guests with consistent excellence. What you did for me wasn't performance. It was character. Marcus read the draft review on her screen, seeing his own name repeated throughout, descriptions of his service that made him sound like someone worthy of celebration rather than suspension. I can't publish this review without your permission, Elena continued. You didn't ask to be made visible. You might prefer to continue working without this kind of attention, but I want you to understand what's at stake. If I publish this, you'll receive opportunities, job offers from better establishments, consulting work, possibly media attention. Your life will change. Marcus thought about Sophia's text message, about textbook costs and tuition payments, and the precarious mathematics of supporting a family on service industry wages. He thought about Henri Beaumont teaching him that service was art form worth practicing with integrity. Publish it, Marcus said, not because I want recognition, but because if my story helps one person in this industry feel valued, then Henri would say I honored his teaching. Elena nodded slowly. There's one more thing. I called Seattle Culinary Foundation this afternoon. They offer scholarships for family members of service industry workers. Your sister Sophia qualifies. I took the liberty of sending her information. They want to interview her next week about covering her remaining education costs. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, relief so powerful it threatened to overwhelm his professional composure. You did that. I did that, Elena confirmed. But I also called some colleagues in the industry. By Monday morning, you'll have job offers from 3 establishments actively seeking someone with your expertise to train their service staff. The salary range starts at $70,000 annually plus benefits, which I assume is substantially more than you're making here. She closed her laptop. James offered you a management position with equity stake when I told him he needed to fix this situation. That's your decision. But you should know you have options now. Real options. Marcus sat quietly, processing information that recontextualized his entire future. 8 years of careful discipline. 8 years of choosing integrity over convenience. 8 years of invisible labor, suddenly visible and valued. Thank you, he said finally, for seeing what most people overlook. Thank you, Elena replied, for reminding me why I chose this profession. To celebrate excellence, not just critique failure. She finished her wine and stood. Now, I believe I'm here for a meal. Would you serve me, Marcus? One more time, so I can document properly how exceptional service transforms dining into something worth remembering. Marcus smiled, standing and gesturing toward the dining room. It would be my honor. 3 months after Elena Voss's review published, Maison Etoile had a reservation waiting list stretching 6 weeks into the future. The review had gone viral within the service industry, shared by servers and bartenders and hotel staff across the country who saw their own invisible labor reflected in Marcus Rivera's story. Elena had titled it simply, "The Server Who Saved a Restaurant by Refusing to Look Away." The piece documented not just food quality, but the culture of dignity Marcus had helped create, the training programs he developed, the philosophy he practiced. Within days of publication, Maison Etoile's phone was ringing constantly with reservation requests. Within weeks, James Chin's bank had extended their loan and offered expansion capital. The restaurant that had been 8 weeks from closure was now profitable for the first time in 18 months. Marcus stood in the dining room on a Thursday evening in early spring, training a new server named David who had transferred from another establishment specifically to learn from him. They were reviewing proper table service technique, the small gestures that communicated respect and attention. The key, Marcus explained, demonstrating how to approach a table without interrupting conversation, is understanding that service isn't about you. It's about creating space where guests can relax and be themselves. You're not performing. You're facilitating human connection. David nodded, taking notes on a small pad. He was 23, ambitious, and genuinely hungry to learn the craft rather than simply earn tips. Marcus recognized that hunger. He'd carried it himself when Henri Beaumont had trained him. Across the dining room, Elena Voss sat at table 12, not as critic now, but as regular guest. She visited Maison Étoile once a month, always requesting Marcus's section, always ordering dishes that challenged Chef Antoine to demonstrate his range. She had become something unexpected, a friend. They talked about industry trends, about new restaurants opening, about the gap between hospitality as ideal and hospitality as practiced. Tonight she was dining with Sophia Rivera, who had graduated from University of Washington 2 weeks earlier with honors. Sophia wore the same white coat from clinical rotations, now professionally pressed, and her smile carried the particular radiance of someone whose dreams were becoming tangible. She had been accepted to medical school at UCSF with full scholarship coverage, partially funded by the Seattle Culinary Foundation grant Elena had connected her to, partially through academic merit. Marcus approached their table carrying dessert, Chef Antoine's signature creme brulee, prepared specially with extra caramelized sugar because he'd learned Sophia preferred it that way. He set the plates down with practiced grace, then allowed himself to break professional protocol and sit with them for a moment. "I'm proud of you," he told his sister, his voice carrying emotion he usually reserved for private moments. "Dad'll be proud too." Sophia reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "He'd be proud of you, Marcus. You gave up your dreams so I could pursue mine." "I didn't give up my dreams," Marcus said. "I found different ones. Turns out service is its own kind of calling." Elena raised her wine glass. "To callings discovered rather than abandoned. To integrity that refuses compromise. To seeing people when invisibility is easier." They touched glasses, the crystal chiming softly. Around them, Maison Étoile hummed with the gentle noise of guests enjoying meals and conversation. The restaurant had been transformed not through menu changes or decor updates, but through commitment to treating every person who walked through the door as worthy of excellence. James Chun had implemented the training program Marcus designed, requiring all staff to complete modules on hospitality ethics and inclusive service. Diana Park had been promoted to general manager with profit-sharing arrangement. Rebecca Torres had been named executive sous chef with guarantee she'd take over when Chef Antoine eventually retired. The young busser Marcus had helped that crucial Friday night, was now working as server, learning the craft under Marcus's guidance. The changes extended beyond Maison Étoile. Elena's review had sparked conversation across the industry about service worker dignity, fair compensation, and the value of expertise often dismissed as unskilled labor. Other restaurants contacted Marcus requesting consulting work. Could he train their staff, review their service culture, help them build environments where workers felt valued and guests felt seen? Marcus had accepted some of these opportunities, conducting weekend workshops at culinary schools and restaurant groups. He talked about Henri Beaumont's philosophy, about treating service as art form, about refusing to measure human worth by economic status. The work paid well enough that Sophia's textbook costs were no longer a source of anxiety, well enough that Marcus could afford an apartment in a better neighborhood with a second bedroom for when his sister visited. But he kept his position at Maison Étoile, kept working the floor 4 nights a week, kept serving guests with the same care that had saved a restaurant and changed his life. Because the work mattered. Because every table was opportunity to practice what he believed. Because hospitality done properly was resistance against a culture that often treated service as servitude. As evening transitioned toward night, Marcus returned to the floor. He served an elderly couple celebrating their 50th anniversary with the same attention he provided to the young tech workers at the next table. He helped David navigate a challenging guest complaint with patience and humor. He reset table 12 after Elena and Sophia departed, folding fresh napkins and polishing silverware that reflected candlelight like captured stars. The dining room gradually emptied. Final guests settled their checks, leaving tips that reflected satisfaction with more than just food. Marcus walked them to the door, thanking each group with genuine warmth. The hostess, Andrea, who had hesitated over seating Elena that crucial Friday night, now greeted every guest with identical welcome regardless of appearance. When the last guest departed and the dining room fell quiet, Marcus stood near the window where table 12 overlooked Pioneer Square. Outside, Seattle evening lights reflected on rain-slicked pavement. People moved through the streets, carrying invisible stories, invisible struggles, invisible worth that deserved recognition. Marcus thought about the woman in worn clothing who had walked into his restaurant 3 months ago, testing whether dignity was offered universally or rationed based on appearance. He thought about the choice he'd made to comp her meal, not knowing she held power to save or destroy. He thought about how easily his life might have unfolded differently if he'd chosen policy over principle, if he'd allowed fear or economics to override values Henri Beaumont had taught him. But he hadn't, and that choice had created ripples extending far beyond one meal, one review, one restaurant. It had validated 8 years of invisible labor, had proven that integrity wasn't weakness but strength, had demonstrated that how we treat people when no one is watching reveals who we actually are. Marcus picked up Henry's worn copy of Escoffier's Le Guide Culinaire from where he kept it in his locker. He opened it to the inscription page. For Marcus, remember that service is an art form. Practice it with integrity. Below Henry's words, Marcus had added his own note in recent weeks. And remember, every person who enters deserves to be seen. Dignity isn't earned. It's owed. He closed the book and prepared to go home, carrying the knowledge that tomorrow he would return and practice this philosophy again. That guest would arrive expecting meals but receiving something more fundamental: recognition of their humanity, acknowledgement of their worth, service that asked nothing about who they were or what they had, but simply said, "You matter, and while you're here, you'll be cared for." That was the legacy. Not the review or the recognition or the opportunities, though those mattered. The legacy was the promise kept, multiplied across every table, every shift, every person who entered seeking not just food, but the deeper hunger for being seen. The restaurant lights dimmed as Marcus walked toward the back exit. Behind him, table 12 sat empty and perfect, candlelight extinguished, but the table reset and ready. Tomorrow someone new would sit there, someone carrying their own invisible story, their own struggles and hopes. And whoever served them would offer the same excellence Marcus had demonstrated. Not because a critic might be watching, not because policy demanded it, but because this was Maison Etoile, where service meant honoring everyone's humanity, where being seen was guaranteed, where clothing didn't determine worth, where integrity was practiced as art form, where every meal was opportunity to prove that kindness wasn't weakness, that attention to the overlooked wasn't wasted energy, that choosing to care when indifference was easier was the most radical act service workers could perform. The door closed behind Marcus with a soft click. The restaurant settled into darkness, holding the day's stories within its walls. And somewhere in a Seattle night, Elena Voss was writing about another establishment, searching for more examples of hospitality done right, more practitioners worth celebrating, more evidence that excellence still existed for those willing to see it. The story ended there, but the practice continued. In gestures repeated daily, in choices made when no one watched, in the quiet commitment to seeing people rather than looking through them. That was service. That was art. That was love expressed through attention and care. That was Marcus Rivera's legacy, and it would outlive any review.